I want to tell you something about the hundreds of families, the fathers and mothers who developed birthing better skills in the early 1970s in the United States. I did body work. I worked with women my age whose bodies had been damaged from childbirth, and I worked with pregnant women. The natural birth movement hadn't really formed. It wasn't until Ina May wrote Spiritual Midwifery in 1979 that really blossomed. And then famous authors you know today began to write, and the movement began to both get organized and it became global. So when I got involved in birth, shortly after I had my first child in 1970, it was by accident. The families who were attracted to me were people that were 99.9% very religious. I am not. They were 99.9% medically high risk. I don't know anything about medical care. I'm not a midwife. I'm not a childbirth educator. I didn't become a doula. I just did body work, and I didn't care about the politics. Couldn't care less where anybody had their baby. I cared about what I did. and I used Lamaze with my husband because at that point there was a very high societal expectation that all expectant families take the first childbirth preparation classes, and they were all skills-based. Lamaze and the Bradley method. And I talk about this periodically and through everything else that I do. It was great that those skills existed, but they were tied to a philosophy, and that philosophy had to do with that those skills were appropriate for pregnant women that were low risk and having a normal pregnancy with the assumption that they were going to have a low-risk normal birth, which wasn't always accurate. And the skills didn't work for everybody, and so families wanted more. Fathers were birth coaches. They really wanted to coach effectively. We as women wanted our husbands or our mothers or our sisters to coach us effectively. We didn't want to suffer in childbirth, which throughout the world, throughout time, women have, because there's never been skills identified with childbirth in the actions of giving birth to your child. And the families that were going to have their babies at home for religious reasons and had medically high risks, they wanted to reduce and prevent those risks. And so we developed skills, and they were piecemeal. At first, from the 70s to the 80s, we really focused on coping and managing with labor pains because 95% of us labored. And cesareans were very serious and only really done if the life of the mother was at risk. And that didn't mean that 95% of women had great births. Many of us had horrible births. 95% of women who labored, that was normal. Whether they had risks and whether those risks became problems and whether those problems became tragedies or not. We all labored. It was just accepted. The medical profession wasn't sophisticated enough. And we, in our society, post-World War II, were not as risk averse as we became later on as the medical profession began to develop. And we started to say to them, hey, we don't want our breech babies to die. Hey, if we come in from a home birth, we expect you to help us and save us, or else we'd all stay at home birth and accept the consequences, and we don't do that in modern cultures. But women in other cultures don't have the leisure to do that. They are going to birth out of the hospital because hospitals don't exist. So we developed skills, and we developed skills first to cope and manage with the natural occurring pain of labor, which can make us feel we're going to die. It's great when women can have orgasmic births, but my experience of being hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of births and talking to tens and thousands of women worldwide, by far the largest percent of women don't like birth and they feel out of control. So we have to understand that home birth is about a place, and it's now, in some countries, become a political stance. Back then, it was often a religious stance, and sometimes it was laziness. I worked with a lot of women back then who smoked cigarettes, and they wanted to have a cigarette after a birth. They couldn't do that in the hospital, so they chose a home birth. So what we want you to know is that you're living in the now, and you're choosing a home birth in the now. And if you're in a country where home birth is normal, we still want you to prepare your body for birth, and we still want you to become skilled at birthing because you want to support the midwife who's going out to home births. If you're birthing in a state or a country where home birth is frowned upon or illegal or not supported by the medical profession, then you really want to become skilled, because one is you don't want to transfer, and the other is that you want to protect the midwives who are putting their families and themselves and their well-being at risk by attending you in those circumstances. And you don't want any potential risks that you have from becoming full-blown problems, because you don't want to transfer. So we hope you take this course seriously. We certainly did. I've certainly spent 50 years of my life taking it very seriously. And I still don't have any political issue about birth. I just think birth has gone down the wrong path. Back then in the 1970s with Lamaze and Bradley, there was a moment in time where there were two paths. The one path was taken, and you're in that now, which was to identify almost everything, Lamaze and Bradley skills, to choices with low-risk normal pregnancies and births assumed to have a low-risk normal birth. And that left out the vast majority of us. So the other path that could have started and didn't start was that even though Lamaze and Bradley focused on three goals: natural birth, pain-free labor without medical interventions, Lamaze was taught probably in every hospital in the United States for 30 years. And what happened was that multiple millions of women, and just let me repeat that, multiple millions of women coped and managed, dealt with, worked through, handled, stayed on top of, and felt in control of labor for the first time in the history of humanity. We coped, we didn't suffer. And that's what the labor delivery nurses and obstetricians saw in the United States. And from that, my generation changed childbirth for you. But instead of having the wisdom to recognize that 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, and we should all be skilled to do this activity, the natural birth movement and those obstetricians early on divided birth into low risk, high risk, natural versus medical, home versus hospital, doctor versus midwife. This has produced the insanity of today. So you're planning a home birth now. Great, wonderful. You want to cope. You don't want to go to the hospital because you've suffered. You don't want to have a long first and second stage because you don't know how to get your baby out of your body and end up in the hospital and have more interventions. And you want to support your midwife because she's doing something in some countries that's frowned upon socially. It's frowned upon within the medical community. So it's your obligation to become highly skilled so that you birth at home and you birth at home well. It's as simple as that. So enjoy the skills, take them seriously, practice. One bit of advice, which is, as a birthing woman, learn the skills you want. As a birth coaching other, learn the skills you want, and then teach each other. And then go back and do the same thing. You learn the skills you want to birth this baby, and your birth coach learns the skills they want in order to coach you and help you. And then share those skills. And together you will have a very strong teamwork and be able to work together beautifully.